Hello, everybody. This is Maximilian Schick from the Cultural Data Analytics Area Chair project at Tallinn University. We're a group of 6 PhD students, six senior fellows, which is AKA postdocs, more or less. And also there's faculty and people from the university involved. What we do here is the Open Lab Seminar series, and this particular one is one in the sub-genre of lab encounters. So we're super excited to have the group of Ted Underwood from Urbana-Champaign. And so basically there's 2 groups in the room right now, and one of the ideas would be to sort of like, let's introduce each other of who we are, like super briefly. And then we are looking forward to actually quite exciting program that Ted has put together. So it's a 2-hour time slot, and we will hear about, and I give you the very, very short version of that, literally called the cohorts. We will hear about book reviews, we will hear about the avant-garde, and also about genre classification, including prosodic features, which is not only a good analysis topic, but also something one can make art out of again, I guess. And so, yeah, I think this is super exciting because Ted is definitely one of the leaders in this, you know, sort of field, which is subject to naming game, where humanities computing, digital humanities, cultural analytics, cultural data analytics, information scientists and science doing cultural stuff, literature, and so on. He's well known for his book, Distant Horizons, and he's working on all sorts of stuff, and including very large data sets, as he hardly trust, right? And so on. So there's a really interesting ensemble of things going on that we are all interested in. And so we're looking forward to this with great pleasure. And so I may start with our group. So my name is Maximilian Schick. My PhD is in art history. I spent a little bit too much time with classical archaeology doing that. But then I joined the physics lab for a postdoc in network science. And then I did some more computational social science before becoming a professor for arts and technology at UT Dallas. And now I'm here at Tallinn University, where I have the pleasure to lead this group. And so I'm just one tiny little aspect of a togetherness of a full spectrum that includes qualitative inquiry, quantitative measurement, computation, and also creative and critical aesthetics. So visualization, but also looking at images. And so what you will see is people from a really, really broad spectrum, and maybe we should do it spectrum-wise. Let's start with Mila. Who are you?
Hi, yeah, so my name is Mila, and I hope that the background noise isn't too disturbing. I happen to sit in a cafe in Helsinki. So I'm a cultural historian. I have been working with like circulation of knowledge, and I'm very interested in this phenomenon, and I have been studying circulation of news in the 19th century press globally, and also circulation of fake historical narratives in the Russian online sphere, which I originally thought that was really marginal topic, and then I realized that Putin is talking about the same things. And currently I'm having this wonderful research project together with practically all of my colleagues, in which we study Soviet and Estonian newsreels. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. Vijuna.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Vijuna. I'm also a postdoc at CUDAN. My work is mostly within the realm of cultural and creative industry studies. I primarily work with film and television industries, looking at trends in film theatrical distribution, as well as how films circulate through the film festival circuit. And another aspect that I'm interested in is diversity in terms of gender when it comes to film creators. but also cultural diversity when we look at languages or countries of origin screened across the world. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Andres.
Hello. I'm a language scientist and I'm a postdoc at the CUDAN Lab. I did my PhD in evolutionary linguistics in Edinburgh, and I worked with corpora and experiments and simulations. But recently, I've been also working, doing stuff with databases of art and media and film festivals, of all things, due to the collaborations here at CUDAN.
Thank you. Xenia.
Hello, my name is Xenia, and I'm also a postdoc at CUDAN Open Lab. I have a PhD in computer science, and here I work with social media, which has a location and the posted throughout cities and museums, and I'm studying patterns there, both temporal and spatial.
Mike.
My name is Mikhail. I am a physicist by training. I've been working for many years in soft condensed matter and in material statistical physics, complex networks, etc., and a little bit with human-generated data, in particular with linguistic networks. And actually, I wanted to mention that I've done some work on modeling COVID epidemics, which was actually inspired by Sergei Maslov, who sort of drawn me there, who is from Urbana. Yes, and for the last year, I'm here as a postdoc, and we try to do various things. One project is with Mila, which is sort of on the borderline of cultural history and city science, I would say. Another one is related to some analyzing some data sets of artworks, and there are some other things going on.
Thank you very much. Hannah.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I'm a PhD student in CUDAN. I'm on the media studies track, and I study qualitatively how legacy media organizations use data for their innovation purposes in this era of platformization and datafication.
Thank you. Jan?
Hi, I'm a student in humanities at Tallinn University, and I study how people self-represent themselves on social media. I work with the data from TikTok, Tinder, Instagram, and whatever. I like it all.
Mark, who's joining us from Vermont.
Yeah, hello, I'm Mark. I'm also doing PhD. I'm currently visiting the Vermont Complex Systems Lab, actually. So also it's morning for me. But so my background is semiotics. So on the one hand, I'm connecting cultural data analytics and semiotics. But what I was recently doing is looking at representations of immigrants as sort of cultural other with large language models and the sentiments towards them in the sort of change in time. Thank you.
Thank you. Tilman.
Yes, hello, I'm Tilman. I'm a PhD student. I'm an artist by training, and I'm working on computational methods for curating large visual collections, mainly from art museums and yeah, from art collections.
Thank you very much. And Mar, is he here? Oh, yeah.
Yes, I'm here. Hello, I am Mark Canetzola. I am doing my PhD in BFM, is the Public Film and Media and Art School. I'm doing practice-based PhD. I'm originally, I am an artist who practice in working with art and technology, and my PhD is about multimodal interaction of latent space methods of latent space navigation. Primarily boiling down to interactive installations who use AI models in new methods of interacting with it. I actually learned about that Underwood about his article of mapping the latent space of culture, and very interested to listen to what is today.
Thank you. Antonina.
Hi, everyone. So I'm a PhD student as well. So my PhD, my study is about art education and how to support it with technology and digital mediation. I'm also I also have an art degree, and my master's degree, my second degree is about educational technology. Also here in CUDAN, I participate in the project which studies the acquisition patterns of contemporary art museums.
Thank you very much. Raul, you want to say something?
Hello, my name is Raul. I'm the first year PhD student at Tallinn University. My interests include, and my research will include audiovisual media and content data, including video on demand data.
Thank you very much. So this you see there's quite a spectrum going on. So I hand over the mic to you, Ted. There's also some external guests we should probably, after your introductions, take into account, because thank you very much for joining us. That's great. Ted.
Yeah, great. I'm Ted Underwood. My background is originally in literary history. I studied 18th and 19th century British literary history. But I was drawn, as my research was relying more and more on large digital libraries, I was drawn into the School of Information Science, which is where I mostly reside now. And we'll present a set of interlocking pieces today that are mostly either about change or about ways of using evidence about the way people responded to literary works to interpret change and differences in literary works. The key insight there is that we don't necessarily know, just by looking at sort of digital analysis of an artifact, what the variables mean. We can measure differences or change over time, but to interpret them, very often we need the evidence of human response, and that's why we're so interested in things like book reviews. So I guess we could go in reverse alphabetical order, since I'm you. We could go to Wenyi next.
Hello, I'm Wenyi Shang. I'm a fourth-year PhD student at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, working with Professor Ted Underwood. And I have just passed my field exam last year. I'm preparing for my dissertation, so likely be in job market in 1 year or two. And my research focuses on adopting computational methods to study literary and history problems, and where I try to find the intersection between digital humanities and computational social science, and use social science models to build on the large digital collection in digital libraries to study the questions that traditional humanists are interested in, but are unlikely to properly answer use the traditional methods.
And I guess Lisa would be next.
Hi, I'm Lisa. I'm a graduate student at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and I'm a graduate student at the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures. And I'm so happy to participate in this project because it allows me to combine my interest both in humanities and in digital, because I have my master's degree in digital humanities too. And I was mostly focused on computational vision and the transformation of literary techniques in film adaptations.
And you're on.
Hi, everyone. It's a great honor to be here. My name is Yuerong Hu. I'm a sixth-year doctoral student at the School of Information Sciences at U of I. My research interests are digital libraries and digital humanities. My training has been in library and information sciences for the whole time. For the first 3 years of my doctoral study, I primarily work on digitized books, as well as librarianship stuff. I'm still working on both of them, but for my thesis, I'm focusing on the user-generated book reviews, particularly cross-culture book reviews and temporal changes of the ranked book list. Thanks, everyone.
And David.
Hi, I'm David Bishop. I'm a PhD student here at Urbana-Champaign. I work in 18th and 19th century British and American literature and also in digital humanities.
And as you'll see from the projects we present, there's not really like a single lab here. We're fairly networked in the School of Information Sciences, and there are a lot of overlapping projects. There's a room that might eventually be called Digital Cultures Lab, but that name, there's not something that has gone up in the door. And if we did give that name to it, it would include several different faculty, including Ryan Cordell and Zoe LeBlanc. It's really sort of network structure.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
So now I think Federico and some other people who are visiting us should introduce themselves.
Yes, Federico and Chico, maybe. Yes, Federico.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'm an outsider. I'm an assistant professor in computational humanities at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And my main research is about studying reader response to computational methods, so fan fiction, online comments to amateur written books and book reviews. And more recently, I'm trying to bring a cultural evolutionist approach to the study of changes in fiction.
Nice.
Well, hello. Hope it's okay to crash a party. My name's Chico. I'm calling from the UK, from the University of Exeter. I come from a zigzag background in evolutionary biology and computational social science, but today I'm in a computer science department as a lecturer, finally working on cultural analytics and cultural evolution, broadly asking questions about how information is organized, used, and misused. I'm very happy to be here.
Nice. Thank you very much. Did we miss anybody? Anyone wants to say something? Okay, oh great. So yeah, let's jump right in, I guess.
Yeah, so we have 4 interlocking projects to present, and so we'll try to keep each one quite brief. Single-digit number of slides, you know. I suppose the way to do this would be to present a project and then pause for discussion, and then you know, and then we'll see where that goes.
Can we basically we can both sort of keep time. So we have a 2-hour time slot, and so we should make sure that the 4th speaker also has sort of enough time. But if we can split it evenly, so every speaker knows approximately, there is now 20 minutes of so that it's 40. So it's basically 25 minutes for everybody, and so you can talk how long as you want, and then the rest will be discussion time. So
discussion, good.
Yeah.
Good. So with that expectation, let me start by sharing slides for the first project. There'll be sort of a different permutation of people in each project, of course. Okay, so I hope you're seeing the first slide here. The idea for this project, this is a project about literary change. It could be applied, and I hope we'll go on and apply it to other media. For instance, it would be fairly straightforward, I think, now with tools like Clip to apply this method to art history. And I would very much like to do that, and maybe also apply it to political change, looking at things like parliamentary speeches. But the basic question here is whether the way we talk about literary change, typically in the discipline of literary history, is right, or whether we should learn something from disciplines like linguistics and political science. Typically in literary history, we tell a story where events or intellectual influences fairly rapidly transform literary history. So the First World War is said to fairly directly lead to certain aspects of modernism, the sense of fragmentation, for instance. Darwin publishes a book, and Victorian novels respond within a decade, maybe 15 years, to the new ideas. In linguistics and political science, researchers have a pretty different account of change. So political views are fairly sticky throughout an individual's life. They may change, but on the whole, if you're voting a certain way in your 20s, it's distressingly likely that you will continue to vote that way through the rest of your adult life. And it's even more dramatic in, say, pronunciation. Pronunciation changes don't happen in the middle of someone's life. They happen when they're 4 or 5 as they're learning language from their parents because they slightly misunderstand some rule about plurals, or they generalize, they get rid of an irregular form because it doesn't fit. So those changes happen by cohort succession. They happen because new individuals have entered a language community or a political community, and their new behaviors tend to persist throughout their lives. So we wanted to see whether this is also true actually in literary change, in spite of the way we talk about it. And the approach here was very much inspired by Kevin Kiley and Stephen Vasey, who aren't with us here. They were, at the time this began, both sociologists at Duke. They published some new methods for thinking about age period cohort analysis, among other things, and separating out the parts of change that are due to cohort, the people who were introduced to the history, or to a period, a particular moment when things happen. So the data we used for this were about 30,000 volumes of fiction, of which we had about 11,000 where we were really confident about the crucial data, things like authors, dates of birth, and the book's date of publication. Digital libraries don't always have those in a reliable form, so we collated multiple sources of data to be more confident about that. And the key variables we're analyzing are the topics in a topic model produced by latent Dirichlet allocation. There are certainly questions you could raise about that. Many people assume that topics will only capture things like subjects and themes. And if that were true, this would be a fairly limited analysis. In practice, topic models capture much more. Genres appear in a topic model. Even forms, like the difference between a short story and a novel, can be distinguished quite accurately by looking at the topic proportions of a document, even though it would seem that should be invisible, because apparently the main difference between a short story and a novel is just length. And topic models they don't tell you anything about the number of words or about the sequence of words. But in fact, even a formal difference like that between a short story and a novel comes through in a topic model. That's not to say it wouldn't be worth trying other approaches here. I would love to redo this. If I approach this topic again, I'll certainly use some deep learning and see if that reveals anything different than we revealed in the topic model. But I don't think we have an a priori reason to think that it will yet. So there were 2 key experiments here. One was, as the title suggests, just to ask how much change is explained by different variables. Regression analysis. We're looking for associations between variables. This is pretty far from a causal model. It's, we can't tell what's causing what basically here. But we can ask how much of the variation in a particular topic variable associated, say, with like the detective fiction genre can be explained either by the year a book was published or by the year an author was born. And we generalize about this by inferring a parameter that Kevin Kiley and Stephen Vasey had called delta, which is basically the amount of variance that can be explained by the cohort variable, year of birth, divided by all the variance that can be explained by either cohort or period, including the year of a book's publication. There's some classic challenges in sociology about age period cohort analysis, because if you have all 3 of these variables, age as well as period and cohort, it becomes perfectly collinear. The year a book was published is just the year the author was born, plus the author's age at the time of publication. I don't want to go too deep into the details, because if this isn't a problem that bothers you, you won't care. There are various ways of fixing that collinearity. The simplest one is just to say, take out age. And we did it that way. But there are also more sophisticated ways where you can leave age in, but constrain the model so that the collinearity isn't a problem. Okay, and with this first experiment, each topic variable has a different delta parameter, basically the proportion of variance that's explained by cohort. We manually categorized. Oh, let me see. I haven't talked about that in these slides. I think I'm supposed to, I don't have that fourth bullet point here, but before we go on and talk about the different delta parameters, I think I was going to invite Wenyu to talk about how we divided topics into categories, 10 categories. Wenyu, could you step in?
Yeah, so we predefined 10 categories of topics, and they could vary from like author dominated, when a topic is dominantly focused on one author's work, and they could include like language if they are using like French words, nationalities if or regions if they focus like Indian or something like that, or historical event, and they could be as specific as these things, or as like more general technological change if they discuss new technologies like plane or something like that. So we do manual annotations of this for each topic, and get the division of the topics into different categories, and try to find the results and compare the results, and to see whether they are dominated by cohort or by time.
Thanks. We also assigned a label to each topic, but that's not going to be important in this analysis. I mean, labeling topics is notoriously a little bit slippery. We did that just so we could think and inspect and understand a little bit about what we're seeing, but we didn't actually use it in the argument. So with the topics categorized in that way manually, and we had 2 readers and inter-rater reliability and all that, into these categories that you see on the vertical axis, you can also sort of see how each topic, each of the separate 200 topics, is associated with a different delta parameter. Some things like historical events, like there's one topic that's associated with World War II. We can see fairly clearly from the words that are involved, particular nationalities and particular like weapons, and also when it peaks. You know, it peaks in the 1940s. It's not hard to see what's going on. That is very period driven, so it has a low proportion. It's basically the dot up here in the corner that is, you know, very far to the left, and because it's obviously associated with a particular point in time when the war happened. But many other topics are associated more with cohort. Mike, you've got a question.
Yeah, and what each point corresponds to? Each point is one topic?
One topic.
And it is sort of a cluster of similar topics. Okay.
That's right. Yes, they're manually categorized vertically, but each point is one topic, and then it has a delta parameter, which is how much change in the regression can be explained by the author's year of birth. And you can see, you know, there's a lot of variation within each category, but there are also differences in the categories. It's not surprising that events are more period driven. And we had pre-registered a hypothesis that events, accidents of transcription, and technological changes would be more period driven than average. And I think we confirmed that hypothesis looking at all 19 topics in that category, although it's not true, interestingly, for technological changes. Sure. Question? Or maybe I just was
yeah, somebody walked by.
Okay, no problem. So the average, you know, if we look at all the topics weighted by their size, the average is 0.547. So most change across this century we're looking at, from the late 19th century to the late 20th century, is explained by cohorts when authors are born. I don't think it really matters that this number is bigger than 0.5. It's not like that was a crucial cutoff. If this had been 0.48, we wouldn't have said, oh, well, you know, our results are totally different. Now we see that periods are very important. I think what matters is more, does this balance of the factors correspond to the way literary scholars in practice talk about change? And there, I think the answer is just very clearly no. We don't spend half of our time talking about generational structure and the forces that shape a new generation of writers in their youth. We spend much more time talking about events like wars, the shift from modernism to postmodernism, which is thought to have happened fairly quickly, and People will talk about these, key crystallizing moments, so forth. So I think this is different than the way we tell the story. There's a second experiment we did. This is a way of looking at change, sort of looking at the whole population. That's interesting, but it's very far, as I was saying, from a causal model. You can get a little bit closer to understanding how this happens and why it happens if you look at individual authors and at sequences of books within their careers and ask, do people actually change within their lives? We're looking at, the regression tells us on a macroscopic level how much change is explained by these different variables or could be explained. But looking at a sequence within an individual's career, you can ask, how does this play out within an individual lifespan? And you find some differences. So for instance, the blue, here we have each of these categories, and then they're just divided into those that seem to be relatively settled within individual life, blue, or those that fit better an updating model in structural equation modeling. And those are orange, and we have some ambiguous ones in the yellow. And this doesn't always track with what we saw in the previous graph. So for instance, events here, actually, although they are very period driven, people don't really change over their lifetimes in a durable way. That's to say, they may change but if you change from one book to the next book in your career, that doesn't indicate that your third book is going to, if your second book is more about World War II, that doesn't necessarily mean your third book is also going to be about World War II. There's change, but it's not durable updating as we modeled it. And actually this makes sense because, right, events, they don't necessarily change people forever. There's wars going on, people write about it, but that doesn't mean that they become war novelists forever. So here, the pattern is reversed to what we saw in the previous experiment. But on the whole, on average, topics that are period driven tend to show updating. Like if there's a new technology, that does mean your third and fourth book will continue to talk about airplanes. In some cases anyway, not all technologies, but and the topics that are more cohort driven do tend to be, on average, generally more settled across people's lifetimes. The really interesting thing we got by looking at individual careers is that we could talk about change across people's lifespans, both in terms of the amount that authors change from one book to the next, and in terms of how much of that change is durable. So here we're looking at the measurement of durability, which you can think of as looking at a triangle of 3 books in an author's career. We can talk about the distance in 200-dimensional topic space from book 1 to book 2, and then from book 2 to book 3. And we can think about the hypotenuse that directly connects book 1 to book 3. And if all of these lines are roughly the same length, then there's not necessarily a consistent pattern of change across time. The author may be changing from one book to the next, but the changes are not cumulative. They're not sort of going in the same direction. On the other hand, if the hypotenuse or the third leg from 1 to 3 is almost twice as long as the other 2, then we have almost a straight line. All these books are, it's a very stable pattern, very sustained direction of change. And what we see is this measurement of durability. So basically the ratio of that third 2-step leg to the other 2 starts out above 1. So there is a change in a durable direction, but that ratio declines a lot as authors get older. They're still changing, but the change isn't necessarily persisting, which is a little depressing. But remember that we're looking here only at the mean of a large number of different people, and we can be confident about the mean, but there's still a lot of variation between people. There are people who continue to change in a durable way into middle age. Yeah, Mike.
So you mean that the larger this measure, the more directed is the evolution?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So people are evolving in some direction in their youth,
Yes.
and they're more meandering in their old age.
Right. Yes. And also the magnitude of change is lower as you get older. So this helps us explain why we saw what we saw. That basically, you know, people do change in their lives. There is updating. It's not the case that people don't change, but perhaps partly because the change becomes less large and less durable over time, the majority of literary change that you see across a century is explained by new people coming onto the scene, and whatever forces shaped, formed those new people. That's still an interesting open question, but it's not well explained by just looking at when the book was published and the immediate circumstances of the book's production. It's the circumstances of the formation of new individuals we can infer that are more determinative on the whole. And that's that. Yeah.
I got a question regarding this. So this fits well with like the problem of multidisciplinarity, right? So in some sense, if you want to get to multidisciplinarity, you have to learn at least 2 disciplines, which takes a while. So you go in a certain direction. So I don't know, you learn information science, you learn, you know, your domain expertise in English literature. But you know, in some sense, you could argue that less durable change at old age is not a sign of decay, but it's also like, you know, at that point, you're able to improvise over what you have learned. And that means you can sort of like a lot of points in the territory become quickly accessible to you. So, you know, you should end up with sort of 60-degree angles, sort of, right? Isn't it?
Yeah, that's one way of thinking about it. Although it would mean that you're not, if you're just moving back and forth between 3 or 4 options,
yeah,
you're not necessarily introducing something new of your own.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mila got a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, this is super interesting. And I think that in general, kind of like looking at this, like what is promoting change and what kinds of continuities there are in kind of like larger time span of different data sets. I was wondering, did you detect any periods of kind of like acceleration, kind of like rapid changes, or certain kinds of like stagnation, or maybe, I don't know, maybe you identified the more radical cohorts of the 1960s or something else that kind of like were kind of like more and more innovative?
You know, Jeroen has done some analysis of this kind, not in this experiment, but the question of whether change accelerates over time is one that you looked at, right, with Ming Jiang. Is that right? Do you want to say a few words about that? We didn't ask that question in this experiment, but Jeroen might.
Yeah, so I'm happy to share the link to the paper later. Basically, we use large-scale book collections from the Hasty Trust Digital Library, and then we do a lot of cosine similarity measurement on the large book corpora to see if books in 3 specific genres, fiction, poetry, and what's the third one? Nonfiction, probably. Drama. Oh, drama. Yeah. Sorry. And then we measure their change, and we try to see if we can see some kind of accelerated change of rates there, and we do detect some. The problem is that we are not 100% sure whether the accelerated change was caused by the content of book or some kind of innovation in the scanning technologies, etc. But we do identify such accelerated patterns. Yeah.
And you know, your question is a good one, Mila, because I don't think we have tested the question about cohorts, whether you can see, you know, a generation of the 60s that is more different than other generations had been. I don't think we have tested that, and it would solve that problem you're mentioning, Jeroen, that like if you're looking at when a book was published, then it's very difficult to separate publication artifacts from actual cultural change. But if you're looking at those as separate variables, then you could actually separate them, right? Because books are printed a different way in the 1970s, but that's not. If you have the variation of when authors are born, you can separate that out. It's a good idea. Mike.
Yeah, Mila asked literally the very question I wanted to ask, but I just wanted to add maybe a couple of comments. One is that I think in maybe Max knows better than me, in this science of innovation, there is this concept of sort of interplay between exploration and exploitation, which is sort of, I think, what you see in this story about rapid change in young age and then more random walk change in the old age. So you first develop some sort of tools, and then you learn how to apply them, and you sort of get some sort of, because if you just learn to write but never write with what you have actually learned, then it's also futile in a sense. So it is useful to that people do produce what they can in their older age. And one more thing, actually, it is interesting. I mean, I of course, due to personal history, know Russian literature and the whole discourse on Russian literature better than English. And it seemed to me that in discussions of the history of Russian literature, it is often exactly cohorts which are stressed. So people speak of a sort of a generation of 1860s of people who came with great reforms like Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, generation of people who went to the Second World War, generation of the poets of the early 20th century. So it is in that sense thought of in terms of cohorts more like than in terms of time. And maybe it is just a difference of different sort of literary science traditions. I don't know.
It may be. I mean, I looked at this project could be complemented really if we wanted to do it in a really reliable way by one where we would analyze literary critical discourse and then look for, we could manually code and then measure references to cohorts and periods. I did that informally with some introductions to English literature anthologies and found, really informally that it's something like 4-to-1 in terms of references to events and periods. There are references to generations, like we certainly in Romantic poetry, we talk about first generation poets, second generation poets. But if at least in the anthologies I was looking at, they weren't actually equivalent in volume. They do exist.
So we started a little bit late, so I think we had another 3 minutes here. So I got a follow-up on this last two questions, and then one other curious artistry question. And so the follow-up would be like, you measure these angles. And this makes a lot of sense if you think in terms of, trigonometry on a piece of paper in 2D. Well, there's this sort of nasty elephant sitting in the room, which is multidimensional geometry, how do we even imagine that kind of space? What does it even mean to be distant X? And what does angle mean in a 200-dimensional space and stuff like that? So how do we deal with that? Like, I think it's one of the most pressing problems we have in this kind of information space analysis, isn't it?
Yes, it is, especially because, I mean, look, so we're looking at Euclidean distance here, really, not even cosine similarity, which would be the angle. And it's true that those, you get weird behavior in high-dimensional geometry. So if you have enough dimensions, then on average, most points are about the same distance from each other, for instance. So there are reasons not to rely too heavily on things like Euclidean distance in 1,000-dimensional space. It's not that it becomes exactly unreliable, but it's not a very powerful discriminating tool. Yes.
So that there, it's sort of something, I think it's a challenge for the field, right? I mean, it's like everybody in this room, everybody who watches this later, it's sort of something like, where in 5 years, maybe we can say, XYZ person has solved this somewhere.
Yeah.
or in Urbana-Champaign, whatever. But I think that is a really interesting thing. We're literally at a point that where we don't have the understanding right now. And maybe Chico can later, like from the point of view of biology, you think about this kind of problem since the 1960s. There's probably, I don't know, are we naive when we're approaching this anew, or how would you say?
Yeah.
No, I feel that in biology, people often are naive, that we often just crunch the numbers and don't think much about it. I find that the discussions, in fact, even in one of Ted's papers about, distance versus surprise, and like, can we measure all that stuff? I find that these discussions are very important because small choices, like, are you going to put something in log scale? Are you going to use this metric or not? They ultimately become ways to try to capture whatever we mean by similar or by close.
Yeah.
And sometimes literally just, if you have 1,000 dimensions and you want to add 1,001st, this extra one, if you want to add an extra dimension, that already is a point where you can make choices of, oh, I'm adding a dimension, but this dimension is going to matter a lot because it's a feature that I really care about. And that's something that people in machine learning often do. They will put weights on different scores, even if they're not explicitly talking about distance. So to sum it up, not being naive, it's important to think about this stuff because it's the core of so much that we measure.
Thank you very much. And the second thing is like the thing that comes to the mind of an art historian when they think about cohorts, and you may have heard this before from other art historian colleagues, is a guy called Wilhelm Pinder, who was the equivalent of, he was sending his PhD students to the Russian front during the Nazi time because he was a staunch supporter of the system. So he in 1928 wrote a book called The Problem of the Generation, Problem der Generation. And he also made this thing, he said like, actually art history library should be ordered by the birth date of the artist. So mostly books in art history back then were artist monographed. Which was sort of like, a cool hack if you think about that, like in art research databases, this is sort of a famous book because sort of the first person to sort of rethink the order of the library. But at the same time, he also made like sort of excessive claims, such as, once a cohort comes in, once Michelangelo comes in, for 20 years, nothing can happen because this one guy sort of occupies all the genius space. And if you remember well, in the network science crowd, there was a very similar discussion going on, right? And so in some sense, there is some truth there. Obviously, if you have 3 professorships at large universities in Korea for network science, at some point they're all given out. And like all the PhD students they produce have to get a professorship in the US because there is no more professorships in Korea. And so the key question is like, in how much, how do you define cohort? Does that mean sort of a continuous sliding window over time, or do you really see these kind of like sort of like 20-year time slots or whatever?
Yeah, this is reminiscent also of like Franco Moretti's theory of genre, where there's supposed to be generational moments where like a whole bunch of new genres enter, a whole genre system enters at once, and then it stays the same for a generation length of time. And then there's another moment. I think it's safe to say, not just from our research in this group, but from a bunch of other researchers' experience over the last decade or so, we're not seeing that kind of discontinuity where there are these, crisp, discrete moments of change separated by periods of stagnation. There may be moments of acceleration, as Jeroen was saying, but it's a subtle, relatively subtle phenomenon. A change in slope. It's not, it's not crisp.
Thank you very much. Maybe we should change to the next speaker.
Yeah, and Jeroen, take it away.
Thank you. I'll share my screen. Can everyone see it now?
Yep.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. For my subsection, I'm presenting our published work on the complexities associated with user-generated book reviews from temporal, culture, and political dimensions. So in addition to Ted and me, our collaborators are Professor Lila Blum, Professor Jana Dissner, our Hesse Trust Research Center Associate Director Glenn Wolfe, and my advisor, Professor J. Stephen Downey. So in the original paper, I share copy paste them here. There's a published version of it and also an open access version of it from Jana's side. So if you're interested in the other projects, you can check them out there. So originally we conducted 3 different case studies empirically to look into the temporal trends of user-generated book lists, cross-cultural divergences of book ratings, and the user power dynamics reflected in the textual book reviews. So for the presentation today, I'm focusing on the cross-cultural divergences. So this particular case study was motivated by the predominantly Western, particularly Anglophone perspectives in existing book review studies, particularly in the USA, because I know our colleagues in Europe are doing a much better job in terms of language diversity and culture diversity. So although different data sources and types of data have been leveraged in the last 20 years, the data sources were primarily Anglophone and focusing on the giants like Amazon, Goodreads, and Library Thing. And the books being studied were mostly the books that are associated with literary prestige, huge commercial success, or some kind of canon text. So I was wondering, what if we're looking into the books from another cultural perspective? So given my own background and my language fluency in Chinese, I choose to compare the book ratings of 2 different websites or platforms. The first one is Goodreads based in the US, and the other one was Douban based in China. So I compared them because they have similarly large use base, and most importantly, they were very impactful among their own readerships, also one in Anglophone readerships and the other in non-Anglophone readerships. And also, we were able to verify that their readerships rarely overlapped. So for instance, for Goodreads, there are users based in mainland China, Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan, and other areas where people use Chinese as their primary language only make up about 0.7%. And here are some more intuitive examples. So here I list the 2 of the most rated top 5 books from each website, and you can see here that some books are rated 40 times to 1,000 times more frequently on one website compared to the other. For instance, the Faulty Our Stars, a very popular one on Goodreads, it has like 4.5 million ratings on Goodreads, but only 3,000 on Douban, and vice versa. The popular books on Douban only have really smaller numbers of ratings on Goodreads. So confirm that there are significant difference. We with hope we could do some very effective cultural comparisons here. So to emphasize the non-Anglophone voices and perspectives, we choose to base our comparisons on the popular books from Douban instead of Goodreads. So we focus on the Douban top 250 5-book lists. This is a real-time book list generated by Douban's algorithms based on people's crowdsourced rating. So here, the upper screenshot is an example of the list. You can see the rankings of the book titles, and some other metadata. To kind of expand our scope of observation, we try to recover this real-time book list in the last 10 years. We were able to collected and leveraged some existing data sets, like they were not like the snapshots in different years. And we also scraped some data on our own. However, given that our data collection was retrospective and crowdsourced, the data from certain years like 2012, 14, and 15 were like still missing. And in total, we were able to identify 552 books that have been on the list in the last 10 years. And then we manually find this book's counterparts on Goodreads. We did it manually because we find a lot of technical problems, issues with Goodreads that prohibit us from computationally finding the right counterparts. And then we did the data annotation, particularly we add culture tags to the books. The culture tags were represented by the languages of the first publications of these books. And then we pair the books. So here is a screenshot from Goodreads, and this one is a screenshot from Douban. We paired their overall ratings, the average ratings, and also we paired their the distributions of the ratings. For instance, how many books got 5-star and how many got 1-star, etc. So we compared 3 things. First, we compared the differences in the ratings. We call it the differences. And second, we compared the distributions of the 1 to 5-star ratings, use KL divergences. For instance, we can see that for this book, it has a like pretty similar overall rating on Goodreads and Douban. However, people were embracing the book differently. On Goodreads, most people gave it 4 to 5 stars, while on Douban, most people gave it 4 stars and 3 stars. So we were interested in this kind of more nuanced differences in the user-generated ratings. And we also compared the total numbers of the ratings across the 2 platforms. And here are some of our most primary findings. So first, although in most cases, Goodreads has far more ratings or raters than Douban books, fewer users would rate non-Anglophone books. It's apparent to us that Goodreads users are significantly less familiar with or interested in non-Anglophone works. And second, the ratings diverged the most for the non-Anglophone books that Goodreads users rated less frequently. For example, here we can see from table 2, the rating divergences on Japanese and Chinese works were significantly larger than the others. By the way, I have to say that Japanese and Chinese works are also the most popular ones on Douban. And third, we find that the fewer samples provided in one culture group, the larger the average differences tended to be, probably because of the limited number of samples. So here's a quick summary of our work. So our case study, this particular one, empirically revealed the cultural dependency associated with user-generated book lists and ratings. And this study, as I mentioned, as one of the few case studies we conducted and we're still working on, partially demonstrated our preliminary exploration towards more contextualized and critical DH studies based on the such kind of web data provisions. And based on our findings, we urge user-generated book review curators, such as digital librarians and users, particularly digital humanities and culture analytics scholars, that we should pay more attention to the potential selection bias, cultural dependency, historical and cultural context of these ratings to improve the scholarly usability and interpretability of user-generated book reviews. For instance, we should specify this is a case in this culture, right? In particular, it's not we should not claim that this is a representative sample or that is a random sample, right? So, because a lot of times this is just a sample and we have to specify the representativeness and context. So for future work, for one thing, we want to further our existing cross-culture comparisons. For instance, we can further analyze the data by the genre of the book or by the pop year, or the styles of the authors, etc. Meanwhile, we look forward to enrich our existing case studies. As I mentioned, this is ultimately comparison between Anglophone and non-Anglophone work, not US cases versus Chinese cases. We did it this way only because of our culture and language limitations. So we look forward to include and engage with more culture perspectives and conduct this kind of comparisons at different levels. So basically, that's my presentation for today, and thank you.
Thank you very much. It's always awkward to not clap or clap.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I already see 2 questions. So there's Mike and Federico.
Should I start?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, basically, I have a couple of just technical questions. Can you go to page 8? Results are
this one.
This one, yes. When you look at the mean of the difference, what is it? Is it mean of the absolute value of the difference?
This is the mean of the KL divergence value. So,
okay. So and it is also always positive, yes?
No. Sorry, could you say that again?
It is always positive, the divergence.
Yes. It's
because it's still the clever divergence.
Yeah.
And well, one thing which maybe you can speculate on, and which is which sort of comes to my mind. Obviously, you have here groups which are of very different size. Yes, you have plenty of Chinese, English, and Japanese works, and very small numbers of others. So basically, out of mere statistical noise, you would probably expect that some numbers are fluctuating more than others, and therefore I just wanted to ask what here is reliable, so to speak. Is difference between Greek and Norwegian? I guess probably not. Or can we be sure that French are large? That for French the difference is larger than for English, for example?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So first, I totally agree with you. As you said, because of the very uneven distribution of the samples, we are not 100% sure to say that, hey, this is very robust differences and patterns, right? And also this uneven distribution itself reflected other kind of culture biases. For instance, the culture biases and the specific tastes and preference of Douban readers. So we should acknowledge that, as you said. But we still think this difference is significantly enough because there were like really huge difference. You can see that for all the other culture, if we view them as one sample, right? If we view them as non-Chinese, non-Japanese, and non-Anglophone works, you will see that their KL divergences are actually pretty similar, like all from around just all around 0.1 to 0.2 actually. But for Japanese and Chinese work, the difference were significant. So in that way, we still believe that this difference is valid and prominent. If that answers your question. And also, as I said, we should really...
That answers the question. Actually, I just wanted to suggest that maybe you can look at Japanese, Chinese, English, and other, that is it. For example, but I wonder why, if we look at the first table, it seems like Portuguese are hugely different for some reason, more so than English actually. No, in the first table, on the left-hand side.
Yeah, and also we might also try just manually adding more non-Chinese, non-Japanese, and non-Anglophone works if we want to kind of look into that kind of differences. We are definitely able to do that. Here we just follow what emerged from the Douban 250 book list. So that's the original distribution here. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, Federico.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting work. I have a question about Douban. Is it like Goodreads where users can only write reviews, or they can also buy books and ebooks?
No, they cannot buy books, and that's why I think it's a good comparison to Goodreads, because for these work and also for my thesis, we did not use the data from the websites like Amazon, who also sell the book at the same time, because we were not sure how can we separate the commercial impacts from this kind of culture impacts. So both of them are just book rating websites. They don't sell books, but it's hard to say, right? You can, as publishers, you can still buy ads there. You might still able to secretly manipulate your ratings there a little bit. I know it's verified on Goodreads, and I think it's also kind of verified in Douban, like you can do something to manipulate the ratings there.
Yeah, and sorry, is it possible also to just leave a rating without writing a review, or you have to do both, or can you do just reviews without ratings?
Yeah, you can leave ratings without writing any textual reviews. I think both Goodreads and Douban allow that. But there is a different, like I think on Goodreads by default, if you post a textual review, it will be publicly available. Unless you choose not to, I guess. But on Douban, it will explicitly ask you every time you write a textual review, like, do you want to publish it publicly or not?
Okay. And do you think is there any way to know what percentage of reviews is private? Maybe looking at the identifier of the reviews.
Yeah, I think we might be able to do that, but first, I think both Dover and Goodreads, they try to prohibit that from happening because they did it under the name of user privacy or copyright infringement, etc. But we know, like, probably just don't want us to use their data. But sometimes, I sometimes still enjoy wearing my librarian hat. We don't want, so for my research, I choose not to work with user data at very low levels because I feel like reading records are, like for librarians, reading records are confidential and really sensitive data. Like for my research, I'm mostly interested in cultural reception at, meso or macro scales. So I try not to look into the details of the user identifiers. I think, I know there were several Goodreads data sets where we could see the user identifiers, although they were anonymized or de-identified, we can still see that this person rated this book and that book. And we can probably do the same thing for Douban users. But I haven't done anything like that for my concerns about the user privacy and also for my concerns about the the legal problems that might be associated with the platform's terms of uses. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. If you're interested, I think we could join forces because we, with other colleagues in Europe, we are building a parallel corpus of book reviews, and we have 5 languages so far. It would be great to add Chinese as well.
Yeah, I've read your publication on the DH conference and your other works as well. So yeah, I will be really excited to collaborate on that. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you very much. My dream is always to act as an enzyme, which is to encourage chemical reactions where you're not consumed on the way. So if this happens and pans out, this is a success for us too. Thank you very much. I have a question also. So if you can go to one of these slides where you can see the sort of star rating distribution. So if I understand well, like if you take the rating details there, where there is like lots of 5 stars and then a gradient of stars, and then in the lower one, you have a peak around 4 stars. So if I understand well, you use the KL divergence to sort of like compare the shape of these distributions, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So now one interesting thing is there's like very oldish papers by Yudilescu, like old, like, 10, 12 years old by Yudilescu about rating systems. There is sort of some limited amount of shapes this can take, right? So there's like the books that are very, very good, that have a peak at 5. Then there's the books that are sort of, everybody agrees they're bad. There's not very many of them. And then there's the ones that have peak around 4 stars, which are the majority. And then there is the kind of polarizing one where some people say it's awesome, some people say it's bad. So now the key thing is like, if you could categorize it that way, there is some sort of like, one could look at motif frequency. Like, for example, if, small languages in your case, like Greek, have only a few reviews, it's probably very likely that most of them look like this, peak around 4 stars. While in a larger language, you get the whole sort of scheme going on, including, I don't know, right? And so the question is, can one go beyond this measure of KL divergence and actually look at the kind of sort of maybe distribution of like, what are the categories, like what genre in terms of review reaction a book is, basically, if that makes sense. Did you look into this a little bit? Like is there certain things that you can see, and what would, for example, explicitly lead to low or high KL divergence, right? Like, is this because books in Chinese are like sort of 5-star, but in Amazon or like in Goodreads, they're 4-star, and then obviously there is this artificial difference simply because you don't have sort of the fan crowd around it. Like how does this work? Could you disambiguate this a little bit more, other than just say KL this number?
Thank you so much. So if I understood it correctly, like if we're not using any statistical things to model it, if we're using some more grounded and intuitive method to observe this ratings, are there any patterns, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, like if you have 10,000 books and you could imagine this kind of 5-star thing is sort of some kind of graphical motif, which indeed it is. And then you sort of like cluster them, sort of in a sense, if that makes sense. Like, do you get like, what would be the clusters of shapes this kind of distribution can take, if it makes sense?
Yeah, I do. And actually, I noticed that for a lot of Douban readers, they summarized it themselves. They were talking about C-shaped ratings, where a book got a lot of 5-star and a lot of 1-star, and merely 2, 3, 4 stars. And according to their interpretation, this kind of books are troubled books because someone loved it so much and someone hated it so much. And sometimes people rush there to give ratings to express their personal emotions about this book. So if they're saying a C-shaped book, they will say, I will only trust it, 50% because this is a C-shaped book. And also they have other metaphors, like if this is a P-shape means that this book primarily got 4, 5, 3 star, but merely 1, 2 star, then we'll say this is probably a trustworthy rating. Sometimes there was the F shape. F shape means that primarily 5-star and 4-star. They will say this is probably a great book, but it's only popular among small groups of people, so you don't only see positive voices. They are using this kind of, particularly with movie reviews actually on Douban, because Douban actually allow people to rate heterogeneous types of culture products there. And these patterns are really apparent with like movies. Well, I think people are giving more intuitive and emotional feedback about the works. So I'm pretty sure this is a very interesting research direction, and I would love to incorporate them in my future work. Yeah, it's great observation. Yeah, and also people like users stay alerted to all kinds of manipulation, or and also they game the system at the same time. So there was a very particular cases where the fans of a pop star, they take collective action to give bunch of ratings to books so that they could quickly mature their new accounts. And then they were able to gain some kind of better credibility platform-wise. And then they will go to their idol's work. Probably it's a TV episode or a movie, and they will use this matured account to give great ratings to their favorite works. And in this case, the books were really innocent here, but somehow they got involved. There were a lot of this kind of weird and really nuanced events going on there, which are interesting, but also complex. So I look forward to looking into them at lower levels and with different granularities in my future research.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm sort of tempted to ask how did you arrive at KL divergence also? Like KL divergence is sort of asymmetric, and so there's this other thing called Jensen-Shannon divergence. But in general, like how did you arrive at this sort of like measure? Because it's sort of like it's a beloved measure of complexity scientists, and maybe not the most straightforward thing coming out of library science. So, but it's a, Could you give a 2-sentence advertising pitch why this measure is something that makes so much sense and people should use it, basically?
I would say because it's relative entropy, and in culture space, sometimes the more traditional distance, the more traditional terms of distance might not apply here in this space. So we're more interested in relative entropy, and also this is honestly just very popular in recent years among culture analytics and the humanities works. I know Ted used it, and also I think Ted explained it a little bit in his paper. And also there were other culture analytics scholars using it, like analyze, for instance, I think there was a paper on PNAS analyzing the speeches during the French Revolution using KL divergency, and they have a lot of better justifications there than I could do here. So I would just say, yeah, I can explain it, but probably not in 2 sentences. But I'm sure it applies to the scenario here. if that answers your question. Yeah, thank you.
Chico raised his hand.
Yes. So on that measure, so there's this French Revolution paper in PNAS. I used that metric recently on a paper where we looked at parliamentary records. Basically, that's another one. Where we looked at news media. We were basically trying to see if the news media in August was different from the news media in July. And specifically, we were trying to see if it was more surprising. But because I tried to publish that in a political sciences journal, they gave me a lot of trouble in explaining to them, why on earth are you using this measure? And I see two reasons there. One is that it really ties in very well together, theoretically speaking, with other information theoretical measures. So I'm really just kind of complimenting what you're saying. And like information theoretical measures like entropy. But also another one is that if you take, for instance, one distribution of, for instance, like the number of stars, or if you're doing that on a topic model, a distribution of attention over topics for, let's say, July, and another one for August, and the absolute difference is very small for every one of the bins, but the aggregated difference is large, then that's a case where a measure of distance might say big distance accumulated over that. But when you impose a kind of null model expectation that, fluctuations will happen, then it's not surprising that fluctuations happen. So if you want a measure that captures the fact that small fluctuations are not surprising, and it kind of doesn't matter, but big changes are surprising, then you want KL divergence. This thing of prior and result, the prior posterior, this expectation and surprisal thing. And those things, they're not really well captured by Euclidean distance or any kind of distance. This notion of like small changes, whatever, big changes, hey, I want to notice big changes.
Thank you very much. I thank all of you for this. This is important for all of our peer reviewers, because when one goes out and defends such a measure alone in one of our little tiny disciplines, then typically that's a hard thing. But here you can see a good example that this is actually something that people use across the board, which is great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Do you want to go on to the next speaker, or?
Sure, yes. Yeah, sure, absolutely. The next project is really the one that brings us all together, but it's also in a work in progress. So I will probably describe it somewhat briefly. Let me see here, share screen. Here we go. I think this is right. Yeah. So, in a way, the story we're telling here, this project kind of dovetails the last two. We looked at change across time and cohorts and periods. And Jeroen's project looks at book reviews and begins to explore like macroscopic cross-cultural differences in book reviews. This is bringing the issue of change and reception together to ask, what can we learn if we combine those? So for instance, we're not going to be able to quite make a strong cultural claim, strong causal claim, that certain kinds of reception directly cause change. But we can certainly ask, are there certain kinds of response, like being reviewed widely or winning a prize or selling a lot of copies, that predict that a book, that make a book predictive of future change? We can look at reception, connect that to change, and say, sort of, where does the future start to emerge if we look at literary history, and if we look at how people respond to books? What kinds of response tell us that a book is likely to predict the future? That's really our question here. Or to summarize it one way, like if we look at the subsection of books that are received as being avant-garde, that get reviewed, say, in little magazines rather than in, newspapers, does it turn out to be true that those books predict the future, that they're ahead of their time? So, like I say, work in progress. We're not going to answer all of those questions decisively yet, but I'll at least show you how we're framing the question, and you may have some useful suggestions for us. So the source that I'm drawing on here is a book review digest of books, I'm including those translated into English, but mostly books published in English across the 20th century. I think that this is still going today. It's by H.W. Wilson and Company, but it goes back all the way to the 19-teens. So for each book, you have a really rich amount of information about the reviews, a selection of reviews, including sort of like where the review appeared here in the Dial or the Independent or the Nation. You have an indication of sentiment that is not us sentiment modeling, but the people who accumulated these reviews at the time in 1917, indicating whether they thought this was mostly a positive review, a plus, or a negative review, a minus, or mixed, minus plus or plus minus. Minus plus is a little less positive than plus minus. And most crucially for our purposes, you have the length of each review in words at the end here. Now, we don't know that these are all the reviews of each book. They're not covering all possible outlets. For instance, little magazines aren't in this book review digest. So we have a separate project that is gathering an indication of how widely a book was, or an author at least, was discussed in little magazines. And we'll also end up merging that in here. But it covers a fairly wide range of reviews, and we can say there's probably a pretty strong association between the number of reviews and the length of reviews listed in Book Review Digest and the total amount of attention that a book got. And in this project, we're just focusing on works of fiction, although Book Review Digest does include other genres. So here's one indication of reception. We also are going to have some other information about reception, like a list of bestsellers or those that won Nobel Prizes or, in America, Pulitzer Prizes. Then we're going to compare that to a measurement of how much a book predicts the future. And let me describe now mathematically how we do that. This is adapted from Baronet et al. On French Revolutionary Debate, and this is sort of consistent with what we've just been talking about, because different measurements of distance and divergence become central here. What Baronet et al. Did in 2018 was to look at a speech in French Revolutionary Debate over a period of years at the end of the 18th century in France, and compare that to the speeches that had immediately preceded it and those that followed it, using KL divergence on a topic vector. So the difference from the past, and because KL divergence is asymmetrical, it was from the past to this speech in that direction, they called novelty, how much this speech is different from what preceded it. And then the difference from the future, they called transience. So intuitively, some speeches are very different from what just happened, because they're like, let's stop, let's all have lunch. And that's, totally different from what, but they're also going to be very different from the future, because they're not influential, they're just weird. They're just one-off. They talked about lunch for 5 minutes, and then they went back to talking about, beheading the king. It wasn't a vastly influential speech, it was just very different. So those aren't the ones that you can think of as being durably influential. On the other hand, if a speech, says, no, let's not behead the king, let's instead behead Robespierre, that's a significant change. And if that change then persists, then you'll have a speech that is very different from the past, but similar to what followed it. And then they said that speech has high resonance. I prefer the term precocity to say that this speech is sort of ahead of its, displaced forward in time. It's more like the future than the past. Resonance sounds to me a little bit like a causal claim, like this speech resonated with the audience. And I don't really want to make, I don't think that this evidence supports causal claims, actually. But we can say the speech is, or this book in our case, is more like the decades that followed than the decades that preceded it. So using this measure of precocity, although I may still sometimes in the pages that follow call it resonance because I'm still influenced by them, we can say which aspects of reviewing are associated with books that have high precocity, that are displaced, that are ahead of their time, that are more like the future. And looking at that, we've measured, we have 10 different sites of reception, and we've pre-registered some predictions about which ones are going to be have higher than average precocity. And we don't have evidence about all of that yet because the work is still in progress, but we have some crucial things. So in general, it's just true that if you take works that are singled out by getting more attention in some way, yeah, they are more like the future than average for other works. So for instance, if we look at a list of bestsellers, and all of these effects are significant, but we're talking about so many books in some cases that the p-value doesn't tell us a lot. So we're looking at instead as a measurement of effect size, like how many standard deviations basically is their precocity above the average for other books. Bestsellers, it's, you know, a little more than 1/10 of a standard deviation. It's not huge. Prize-winning authors, Nobel or Pulitzer Prize-winning authors, a little bit more. If we look at the word count of reviews and add up the number and length of reviews, and then separate, well, in this case, we don't have to do it as a binary thing. We can simply look at the correlation of the amount of attention a book received in Book Review Digest and its precocity, its displacement in time. Now we have about 1/3 of a standard deviation. But the strongest signal we found was a group of books that we manually constructed to represent what would now be thought of as the avant-garde in the period we're looking at, which is from 1916 or so to 1949. We haven't gone beyond that, so we're looking at early 20th century books. And David and Lisa constructed a list of books that they'll talk about in a moment that represent what we now think of as the early 20th century avant-garde. It's a little bit circular because the fact that we now think of them as the avant-garde might be due to the fact that they were influential. This is not an independent measurement, right, of what was thought of as the avant-garde at the time. But looking at this group of books, we do find a very significant displacement. Like they're almost a full standard deviation, higher precocity than other books. So, but we're looking at a small group. This is still work in progress. We have like 50 books in this group, but right now I've only measured this for 19 of them. So you're really seeing this emerge. David and Lisa, could you both talk a little bit about how you constructed this group? Like what represented the avant-garde?
Yep. Basically, Lisa and I would just confirm that a given text from this target time period was thought of as avant-garde by finding a published reference to an author or title as specifically avant-garde in some form of secondary literary criticism. And we ended up just compiling all that data. Lisa, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I mean, yeah, we took some secondary resources like articles or monographs or textbooks. And for us, it was important to look at the context and realize that the work was considered as avant-gardistic or extravagant or something very, very specific. And so we kept all the quotations. So it was like relevant, yeah, that we took exactly this or that book. And it is important that our spreadsheet, it consists, as Ted said, of 50 items. And we decided that we will have only like 1 or 2 books for each author. So for example, we don't have like 3 books of James Joyce in our spreadsheet or 5 books of Virginia Woolf. No, it is impossible. So we try to make our spreadsheet as diverse as possible. And our writers, they're pretty different. I mean, they're from different countries, from different nationalities. And it is like also important because we can overview different cultural traditions thanks to this. And some like the core things which is common for different like French or English or American or even Russian tradition.
Thanks. And that's all I want to present today. We've got more sort of speculative analysis and things are still emerging, but I just wanted to give you a sense of where we're headed here using reception to start to think about. It's not quite a causal model, but we can see sort of where the future is emerging in different social regions. Now, in the retrospective avant-garde, that's not going to tell us much about what was happening in 1930. It tells us, it's sort of an interesting confirmation that we're now right, that these books were ahead of their time. But we are also going to look at it at the time by doing things like looking at books that are more widely reviewed in little magazines or in elite publications than in sort of mass circulation publications. And for that matter, we can just look at all the possible places where a book could be reviewed, and we could ask, which of these magazines did the best job at identifying books that were sort of significant bellwethers of change. So yeah, the one other thing I'll highlight is if people are interested in this question of KL divergence versus other distance measures, I sort of skipped over this, but we are using KL divergence here only because just to avoid debate with other people who have used that measure for this kind of measurement of resonance or precocity. But in fact, as I show here or as I mention here, I don't show it in a little side note, it doesn't really matter with this particular method whether you use KL divergence or cosine distance. I published an article a couple of years back with Richard So showing you get very similar results. In fact, that's itself an interesting question, but let me stop there.
So I got a little question regarding this. So obviously, supposedly, I mean, you may have tried it out. It depends a little bit on like how you construct your topic model, right? And like in how far you get rid of stuff such as, I don't know, 1,000 words or whatever. So
yeah, we don't get rid of many stop words. Getting rid of stop words would be a very, that would be an interesting choice, right? You would exclude a lot if you got rid of a long list of stop words.
Yeah, so the reason I'm thinking about this is like I'm obviously, as an art historian, I think about like how people do relative dating and stuff like that. And the other thing that comes to mind is co-citation bibliographic coupling, like anything that's fanning out into the future and the past. So if you do this like with artworks in a qualitative way, you sort of like, you definitely press certain things like the human body doesn't look much different over time, for example, but you say, okay, there is like if you look at from impressionism to post-impressionism, like, sort of points coming up more, color getting more, doing different changes, which are sort of systematic. And there you can sort of like ask yourself the question, in how far are you ahead or behind time? And there's many, many different things going on too. And then the question is indeed, what does it even mean to be a standard deviation ahead or in front? Because your KL divergence, for example, depends a lot on the distribution you deal with, basically. And if there is something that's very nervous on that thing, then your standard deviation will hang on this nervous thing. Well, if the rest is sort of little stable, but actually all the crucial difference, if I spot if it's a Caravaggio or not, it's probably a teeny tiny difference that I can spot because I have my eyes attuned to it. So the key question is like, how dependent is the outcome on how you sort of configure your topic model, basically?
Yeah, and I mean, at least you would want to do this with multiple topic models, I think, right? Just to show how much that matters. But then also, I really think probably you will want to do this with deep learning too. So for instance, with images, clip embeddings would be a logical thing to use, and I would love to do that. You could do something similar for texts, although I'm a little bit less certain that we have a good sort of document level representation with deep learning.
Maybe we came up with something called temporal resemblance. Maybe Andres can explain a little bit what that is, which is not the same thing, but it's sort of related. Like we're asking ourselves how systematically different are artworks in relative to a lot of other artworks. Basically.
Please do, actually.
So what we did is basically kind of similar, I guess. So we didn't use clip or ResNet or anything like deep learning. We used something also I think we came up with by ourselves, which we termed compression ensembles. So it's basically a vector of compression ratios of various transformations of the original image. So it gives a sort of a measure of aesthetic complexity, but from various angles or various aspects of an image. So not just like compress something using GIF, but compress various versions of the image using GIF. And then that also gives a vector space, just like a topic model yields a vector space. And the temporal ensembles, I mean, so basically it comes down to just finding nearest neighbors in the space. We use cosine similarity, and then just measuring how, on average, how far are the nearest neighbors. So if you're an artwork in 1900, like, are your nearest neighbors in the medieval times, or are your nearest neighbors in the future? And we did normal, like, of course, the data set is bounded, and you know, you're more likely to have neighbors in the past if you're towards the end of the data set. All that, so we normalized for that. And then we got some results, but of course these results are quite hard to validate. So if you can find like singular examples, say, oh, here's a Mondrian, and this Mondrian looks quite like futuristic in his own timeline, but beyond qualitative evaluation, it is quite hard.
Is the advantage of compression ratios over something, I mean, in a way, this is sort of independent of any training set. So you don't have the problem like with clip. What was it trained on?
You don't know what's in it.
Yeah.
It also answers different questions. Like, I mean, we were interested in aesthetic complexity. So when we look at like temporal change or temporal resemblance through this lens, it's more about like, you know, in terms of this sort of aesthetic complexity profile, how similar is a Mondrian to, I don't know, medieval paintings or cubism or whatever. Whereas if you use something like, you know, something trained on an ImageNet, for example, then, you know, it will give you different kinds of similarity. Like, you know, does this picture also have dogs in it?
Yeah.
So, you know, it's different things for different questions.
This is a method that is tuned to think about art history rather than dogs and cats, which is what the internet will mostly care about.
Actually, yeah, the idea was to explain, like, to capture what could not be captured by, in some way, verbalizing or categorizing it. Like, if you can say, okay, this is a dog, then, you know, you draw a pencil line around it like UNESCO World Heritage Site on a map. No, but we were exactly after like what cannot be sort of like easily captured like this, and what Wittgenstein called family resemblance, basically. And there the idea is obviously, you know, then there's another effect you get out of this, which is you exactly know what your dimensions mean. Insofar you can say, you know, exactly what a Fourier transform is or a Gaussian blur. Obviously it's a catch-22, but you know, at least you can say, okay, this particular thing, this axis is Fourier transform, this axis is Gaussian blur, and then you can actually make statements about the space. And this is sort of like what we're interested in. We are interested in the shape of the space, which as you know, with neural networks or with topic models, it's like wrestling an octopus. And so we're sort of like dealing with a sort of like more stiff octopus, I guess, but it's still an octopus, I guess. But yeah, so these two things can be mixed. Sort of. Yes.
I suppose that could be adapted for texts too, couldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, that's interesting.
We're up to it.
There's a thing in text that you can do anchored topic models. So, you know, I want two topics with the word spring, and it will find two that are very separate. One where spring is to jump into action, another that's about the season. And that still leaves other meanings of spring that you're not addressing, but you can kind of anchor it.
Yeah.
There's one of these like network-based topic models.
I'll post the link to the one I'm thinking about, but it's not. I'm not thinking of top SVM, the structural like stochastic block model. I'm thinking of a different one. I'll put it here.
And there's also these models where you language embeddings where you span out the axes with antonyms and stuff like that. So it's basically like a Frei-Otto tent where you have like sort of rods of metal going through, and then you can like talk about the space too.
Yeah, you can create semantic axes, and yeah.
Exactly. So I think this is like sort of an interesting thing, which sort of like crystallizes out in many places in cultural data analytics, but also biology and stuff like that, where we need to understand these meaning spaces, and the meaning spaces themselves, as opposed to text or images or social interactions, whatever, become the subject of analysis. And sort of, you know, I would love to go out and like write a funding application and say, I want to understand a variety of cultural meaning spaces. And I obviously, out of experience, know what my humanist colleagues will say about it, but which is sort of fun for later. I will write a book when I'm retired about this, I guess. The key thing is, I think this is something that's worthwhile, and it's sort of an unsolved problem that we're all struggling with.
I had one technical question. Is this thing you described to us published or not yet?
Work in progress. Not yet published. Work in progress.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I would be very interested to read it.
So thank you very much. There is another talk coming up, and we have 20 minutes to go. So basically, yes.
When you take it away.
So my project is our project here is not really directly related to the previous ones, because it's focused not on the reception of the literature, but about poetry classification of the pre-modern, not really pre-modern, but of English poetry, where we try to build a taxonomy, or at least propose a possibility of taxonomy that we try to disentangle different concepts of English poetry. So I've first introduced the background. So the boundaries between forms and styles in English poetry are very blurry. So these terms, together with genre, are often used interchangeably. So we do not have a fixed definition for these terms, and they are used differently in different occasions. For example, here, Poetry of Howard definition, they said that whereas a form defines the way a poem arranges sounds, rhythms, and all experience on the page, genre is something like the poem's style. So here they're using genre in the term similar to style, which differs from form. That, for example, they're trying to describe a form as kind of a poem's rhythm and sounds, but genre, like style, describes dictions. But this is not a consensus of the definition. People still have different views of genres, and they may use genre in the term for form described by Howard. So in this project, we try to address this question computationally from different perspectives, that we do not try to delve deep into these definitions, but we try to address this question by asking how the relative importance of lexical, we call this styles, and prosodic features, we call these forms, vary across different genres. Here, genre simply means categories. So we're trying to see that people define poems, divide poems into different categories, and some of them we will argue that have more connection with the diction they're using, and others by the prosody they're using. If we can divide the different poem poetry categories into these two types, we will have different understanding on this problem. So here's what I have done. We use a data set of the top 8 genres. In genres, we use a definition by Chadwick-Healy Literary Collection, which is our collection. And here we simply, again, using genre as category. So we add the different way of defining poems. We got 30,000 poems here. And the features, in order to get features, we extract lexical features by transforming text into an array of word frequencies, so just word frequency, and also extract prosodic features, including foot type, so which is kind of iambic, something like that, and feet number, like pentameter, so the number of feet, and also rhyme style, like enclosed rhyme, alternative rhyme. So they are just basic they're basic formal elements of the poems. We use a Python library Poesy. I'll skip the details here. And we train the classifier by research to select the best algorithm and the number of features. And the final classification, we use a random train test split and compare the performance of the two classifiers on. We use 2 tasks, so which is the first 8 genres, all 8 genres included classification, also 2 classification for each of the 8 genres. For example, sonnets against non-sonnets, and ballets against non-ballets. And the results, first for the 8 genre classification. So first, the lexical and prosodic features have very similar overall performances. We can look at the top of the figure that their accuracy for the lexical models is 0.688, and for the prosodic 0.656. So they are quite similar. But if we delve deep into this figure, we find that the results on different genres or categories significantly differ. So if we look at the left figure here, the lexical classifier classified ballets and metrical sums, we can see that ballet has 0.91% accuracy, that 91% of ballets are correctly labeled as ballad here. Also metrical sums, 85% of it are correctly labeled as metrical sum here. But they easily confuses heroic couplets with sonnets and epigrams. If we look at the third row, we can see that 29% of heroic couplets are wrongly assigned as sonnets. And if we look at the third column, we can see that 53% of epigrams are wrongly assigned as heroic couplets. So we can see that if we're only using the words, the diction, they sometimes confuses heroic couplets with other forms. And on the contrary, if we look at the right figure, we can see that heroic couplets here, the third column here, third column is a row. Hero couplets here are very well classified. 91% of hero couplets are correctly labeled as hero couplets, very different from the first figure. But what is well classified by the first figure, ballets are not well classified here. They can easily confuse with metrical sums and lyrics. That's we look at the fourth column and the fourth row. And this can be confirmed by the 8 genre classification task. So here, sonnets and hero couplets, we can see that the blue and green line reaches peak when we're using the rhyme and rhythm, that is the prosodic features. But the ballads and metrical sums, the red and purple line here, are better classified. The line reaches peak when we use lexical of dictions to the lexical classifier. So based on both of the results, we can see that they correspond to each other, and we can preliminarily summarize as different genres are distinguished by different features, while ballets and metrical sums are distinguished by the diction they're using. Sonnets and heroic couplets are defined by prosodic features. So here we can preliminarily summarize that different poetic categories we can confirm the hypothesis that different poetic categories are defined by different features, some of diction and others by prosody. So conclusion. So this findings tell us a lot about things about history of English poetry, like the rules of lexical and prosodic features in poetry genre classification, and how such rules differ in different genres. These are what we can summarize from the results. And we would like to argue that the most important potential contribution of this project is to distinguish the concept of genre and form. So we haven't really proved that to the direction we would suggest based on the results. So if some poetic categories are best identified by prosody and other by style, that's what we proved by the results. It might be possible to disentangle form from other aspects of genre. So if we can preliminarily suggest a taxonomy that, so the first level is genre, so poetry can be divided in different genres, and some of these genres are defined by the prosody. So we can call this forms, and others by the diction. So we can call this styles. So we know, if that is the case, we can propose we can divide poetic genres into different categories and suggest a new taxonomy that can gain better understanding into English poetry. So we can confirm that we can reinforce the arguments of previous scholars based on their view on case studies. We can prove that with the larger collection of poetry and experiments, that genres operates on a larger scale than form. So genre can be divided into like form and styles. And that is our, and we will certainly do future follow-up works to confirm and propose more solid arguments. And that's it.
Thank you very much. So yeah, thank you. This is great. I like, this is more a comment, let me say first, not a question. This is exactly what our thought process with this compression project was. We use different transformation of images, which distinguish images in different ways. And so your two confusion matrices are quite interesting because, like, from our perspective, they would sort of cry for being combined. Like, you want to have a combined measure where sort of these two things that you do sort of work together, and then basically all of it becomes more distinguishable, and probably in this particular case, your diagram will probably become more clear. This is like an expectation I have. And so for the images, we sort of, not only do we find that multiple of these transformations allow us to distinguish images, also different tasks, like author identification, dating, genre/style classification, have sort of different weights on what transformations say what. So it's exactly the same thing, basically. It's really interesting. So I find it funny that we stopped the conversation about the previous talk about exactly this, and now we arrive at something that is exactly that. So it's really cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, I can confirm that if we combine the features, it will get better results, but we are not proposing to get the best classifier here, because if we are combining all the features, the machine, the model will learn the lexical features for the one we find better classified by lexical classifier, and the prosodic features where we find better classified by prosodic features. So we are trying to compare the different performance and try to divide them. But yes, I can confirm that if we combine them together, we have already tried that, we'll get better results. Yes.
Thank you. Mila.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is super interesting, and I love your approach, kind of like looking at the genres from this perspective. And I was actually wondering that while you were doing this research, did you find any kind of like new genres that were not identified by other kind of like previous scholarship done by close reading, or maybe did you kind of like identify maybe some kind of like confusion genres, kind of like that overlap somehow, kind of like some new approaches to genres that, maybe based on previous scholarship, previous scholars have not identified? Because I think there is maybe potential for these kinds of findings also with your approach.
Yes, that's a great question. So here I would like to explain a little bit about data. So the categories we're using now are just brought by Chadwick-Haley collection. So when they're seeing a genre as a genre, they're just trying to see categories. So they are just simply manually tag different poems into different categories. And so if actually your point is actually what we are trying to point of shed light on the future directions. That is, if we can prove some categories are defined by genre, by the styles, and others by the forms, we can see that there will certainly be intersections. For example, if we can see that sonnets are defined by forms, but ballads are defined by the diction. So if that is the case, we will see that there are certain sonnets can be kind of can be also defined or like can be described as ballads. So this could be proposed as new categories. So if we can see that we can really divide poetry genres into forms and styles, so they can be combined and propose a new framework. But yes, I think we certainly need close reading for that. That's really a literary question. Yeah.
Yes, and I suppose it would be possible. I mean, you've come up with several good ideas that we should borrow, Mila, in the course of this. And I suppose it would be possible to do clustering on these features and to see if we, if there are groups of poems that, in fact, Chadwick-Haley has not identified as a separate category, but that we could. I think that probably could be done. Yeah, go ahead.
Have you thought about out of basically Chadwick-Haley corpus is probably what could be, let me use this word in a very sort of grain of salt way. It could be considered classic poets. in the same way that like Jackson Pollock is still classical painting. So the key thing is like, could you imagine like a completely out of sample, you know, extension of the corpus that would violate your classification in some interesting way? Like I'm thinking about classical music versus whatever happened after Ferruccio Busoni and Varese and John Cage took over. So is there, like, what are the limits of the corpus in sense?
I think when you did do this, it's not in this paper, but I think you did look at like how this varies across period and stuff like that.
Yes, and that's our next step. So I think we have already done some preliminary exploration for that. So we try to see that how can different lexical and prosodic model how accurate they can predict poems of different periods, different locations. So here's only English and against American, and also different poets. Like we can see that if canonical poets are better classified by lexical features, they're really defining the diction used in this genre, and also we can see that translated works are not very well classified by the prosodic features. So it's really hard to capture the prosodic elements if we are translating the works. And so this different perspectives really could help us gain more understanding, especially as you mentioned, different periods of the poems and the evolution of the different genres.
But there were things like Shakespeare's was very easy to classify, and that might be, as you say, because he's defined our understanding of the sonnet. So something like that.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? I have a question, like, should we have a sort of general discussion around like where we have about 5 minutes to go, and so maybe we should sum it up somehow. This was certainly exhilarating from all of you, and I personally am not a literature person, and so it's really interesting to see like how the interweaving of many disciplines works when that is sort of the center from which we grow out of. And I think that's really, really interesting. So how do you expect the future for the work that you're doing to roll out? Like, is this something which will, you know, will we call it cultural data analytics? Will we call it cultural analytics? Will we call it digital humanities? What would it call it in 10 years?
I don't know, or computational social science. It's interesting to me that your group is similar in some ways to what goes on at the School of Information Science here, in that there's a lot of interest in concrete questions about, like, you know, film reception, network analysis of the social world around culture. So that if you looked at not just at our group, but at the broader context of the School of Information Science, there would be other points of overlap, I think, too. There are many people who do more with network analysis, for instance, than has appeared today. And also, striking how much, like, your measurement of using compression, for instance, to think about a more meaningful cultural space, that could be adapted to literature. Or I hope, you know, some of these projects that we're doing will expand in the direction of images too. I really want to move in that direction.
I think this is a really interesting kind of direction you point out to. Like, you landed in an information science school, and there's some of the examples across the US in particular. Information science schools where cultural stuff is done are growing vigorously. The schools themselves are growing vigorously, but the cultural stuff is also growing vigorously within these schools, while famously humanities departments are stagnating. And so, supposedly. So the key thing is that is sort of something which is quite interesting. So there seems to be a home for multidisciplinary people, which is called the iSchool in different universities. And that is a really interesting sort of take home, I think. So digital humanities seems to have at least one other home in these places, and not just as the auxiliary sort of computer service branch of humanities department. And I think that is a really, really neat thing. And your work gives a lot of like example for exactly that. That there's a lot of things that you can do with your work that, you know, with regular methods of literature analysis, it's out of reach. Yeah. So
I see Mila has left, but if we do that analysis of the speed of variation across from one cohort to the next, I will have to at least give her a footnote to her, because that was rather a good idea.
Nice.
To try that. Thank you.
That's great.
Thanks, Mila.
We will, and so let me close the meeting with the look into the future. So basically, we have no Open Lab seminar next week. And next week, I will be in Zagreb, where there is a digital art history conference where I will give a keynote. And then in the second half of next week, there will also be the Digital Humanities Conference Estonia, which has actually quite a nice lineup of speakers. And so this is really cool. And it will happen here in our premises. And the interesting thing is, so basically there's back-to-back 2 conferences going on. Therefore, both next Monday and the Monday after, there will be no Open Lab seminar. And we will return actually with Luba Elliott, AI art, finding its place between technology, contemporary art, and NFT on October 17th. And so this is also something we look forward with great pleasure, because there is a lot of AI art stuff happening, both analytic and practical here. And so we would love to have you all there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So thank you again for standing up that early in Urbana-Champaign.
Thanks for inviting us. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.